Hey, I'm John Roy again with Stephen Clyborne. We're talking about Pelham Road Baptist Church's early years. Churches, when they're born, search for an identity. And one way you try to form this identity is in the pastors you choose. Also, churches have not always a flat line of growth or a flat line of development. Sometimes it stops and starts, and as you would say, false starts. And so we're going to sort of try to put in perspective several things over the course of several years. One of the pastors, the earliest pastor after Bob Freeland stepped aside, Don Smith. All right, and Don led the church for several years, but there was a crisis. So try to describe who Don was and probably what the identity the church was trying to wrestle with at that time.
Okay. I do think that in choosing Don, the church was trying to infuse new energy into the church. Bob Freeland was a very traditional kind of stately pastor. And I think the church in its early days was looking for a real boost and a quick growth strategy.
Mm-hmm.
And so they were drawn to Don, I think, because he was an evangelist. He was an evangelist, not a pastor, when he came here. He was very he had a very charismatic kind of personality. He was very evangelistic, very musically talented, and so he made a big impression and a fast impression on the church. And I think the church was trying to honor its relationship with Central, but early on was also trying to distinguish itself from Central. That while the church was grateful for the influence of Central, the church was trying to forge its own way. And so this was its first attempt to kind of settle into an identity. It just turned out that turned out not to be the identity the church was most comfortable with.
Right. And so there was a crisis because it didn't fit exactly who was here as a congregation. Kind of like the sower sows the seed, and some of that seed grows really fast, but there's no roots, and so it dies away. That's right. Kind of what I hear you saying in this story. So Don's replaced by?
Well, there was a pretty long interim, Joe Roberts, and then Bill Marler was the next pastor.
And while we have our own video on Bill, the summary of Bill was that they kind of overcorrected. Is that what you would say?
I think that's one way of looking at it, that because they had been through this crisis at the end of Don's ministry, and basically half the church left and moved down the road to what was then called Metropolitan Baptist Church, located where Grace Church is now on Pelham Road. Because there was that crisis, I think the church determined that it did not want to make that mistake again. So they called someone who had a lot of education and credentials, was more scholarly, more staid, less emotional, and may have in retrospect overcorrected.
Okay. Now that, again, remember, we're talking about identity and how churches form identity. So you test drove one style in Don, then you test drive another style in Bill. And the reason why Stephen is here is because Stephen's entire ministry has been in Greenville County, and he started off here at Pelham Road, so he knows this history. He knows most of these people pretty well. So after Bill, it was David Haney?
Yes.
Okay. So David was, as I remember David, because I met David, he seems a little bit like in the Bill Marler tradition.
Yes. He's definitely more in the Bill Marler tradition than he was in the Don Smith tradition.
Okay. And then he was again, so the church is trying to form an identity. They put two pastors back to back who have sort of a similar identity theologically and in the methodology that they use to lead the church. But, if you're not necessarily getting the results on the ground that you think you should be getting, you might change that direction. And so then they changed and they hired who?
Kerry Hedgepeth.
Okay. And I don't remember Kerry's years here, but Kerry came in and he was a different personality. A little bit more, he had a little bit more personality, I guess. He was outspoken a bit and someone that the community could rally around. And he had a ministry here for 3 years.
I was gone by that time.
Yeah, you were
so
gone.
I don't remember how long he was here, but I would say, as I've tried to piece the history together, probably 3 years or so.
Okay. And so now, remember, we're going to always circle back to identity. The church has been trying to form an identity. It tried out the Don Smith style. It's tried out a couple of people in the tradition of Bill Marler. Then it went back to Kerry Hedgepeth, which was a little bit more like Don Smith.
Kerry was much more like Don Smith without the music.
Without the music down. All right. And so you've seen these two styles sort of wrestle back and forth in the congregation. And then after Kerry comes along Ron Rich. And Ron Rich comes in and provides a lot of stability. He comes in the late 80s and stays through the late 90s. And so while you had a church that had a series of 3 and 4 year pastorates, now you had one that had 10 years. And so now the identity seems to be, the concrete might be getting a little hard now. And so you want to say anything about Dr. Rich?
Just that I have immense respect for him. And I actually knew Ron through Bill Marler.
Okay.
Bill and Ron were friends.
Okay.
And Bill had Ron to preach at Calvary for a revival. And so I got to know him back in the 80s.
Mm-hmm.
And he is just such a stabilizer,
Mm-hmm.
and gave this church the stability it needed and the comfort it needed to kind of start to form its own identity.
Mm-hmm.
And feel secure in that.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a great summary. He provided that identity and the stability that the congregation finally had found in their type of leader. Okay, Dr. Rich finishes up his work in '98, and of course we mentioned that Joe Roberts had been an interim here a couple of times, and much beloved. Me and you're not going to go into who he was or whatnot, but after Dr. Rich, it was Dr. Doug Baker who came over and had a powerful influence here. He was here almost 2 years. Well, I can see he was here a little bit more than 2 years. But after Dr. Baker, what happened next at Pelham Road?
Well, that's when the church's story really took a nosedive.
It did.
Because they called its current pastor.
Who was that?
Dr. John Roy. And seriously, that was when you came.
That's right.
And you've been here now 25 years.
Absolutely.
Half of the church's history.
That's right.
And if there was ever any question about whether the church has settled into an identity, I think that question has been resolved now. and because of your steady but creative influence in this church, the church really has settled into an identity and seems so comfortable with who it is. And it's a great joy for me because I was here in the early years when the church seemed to get off to several false starts and couldn't quite settle into an identity.
Mm-hmm.
I think between Dr. Rich and you have given this church an enormous gift, and that's the gift of being itself,
Mm-hmm.
and a gift of its own sense of identity.
Right. Sometimes I think that it's not so much. I mentioned at the beginning that the pastor does help form the identity, and that's undeniable. But I do think also what happens is people gravitate towards a place where they can be themselves, where they do not have to be phony. And they like that sort of expression. And sometimes that expression is high church, sometimes it's low church, sometimes it's Pentecostal, sometimes it's, ecumenical. But a pastor can sort of set the table a little bit, but the people come to the place where they can be themselves as well.
Absolutely. And let me say something else. On a personal note,
Oh, no.
it's really important to me and significant to me that because I was here literally in the first days of this church,
Mhm.
that now my own personal life has come full circle, and now one of my best friends in the world is the pastor of the church where I started.
Mhm.
And it's just beautiful to me how that has come
Full
full
circle.
circle to me. And now, even though I'm not here and have been gone here for a long time, because you're here, this still feels like home to me.
Well, thank you. Those are kind words. All right. Thank you.